with another trip, a trip through history. There are 4 important periods. I'm not going to ask you to know by heart after this talk the 24 or 25 dynasties of China. Let's keep it simple. China has 2,000 years of its ancient history, from its first dynastic period, its first dynasty, until the moment it became what we call an empire, a unified empire. Before that, before it became a unified empire, China was a confederation of states called the Middle Kingdoms in plural. Then we have an early period of China as a mighty state. At that time, from 221 BC to 907, thank you very much, China became a world power. Then there are the later empires that go all the way up to 1911, when China became a republic. And now we have modern and contemporary China, 100 years of modernization and progress. During its early history, 中国, China, meant the central states, or should we say the United States, united under a king who was a symbol of this unity and who was not the Lord, not the master, not the emperor, but who was the son, or better, if we be really truthful to Chinese, the child of heaven, 天子. This story of the child of heaven and the confederation of China begins at around 2000 BC, before the Common Era. Already we find bronze implements. Already we find exquisite jade and lapis lazuli work. And already we find the most beautiful Neolithic pottery known in the world. And then Chinese history or mythology has it that there was a man called the Great Yu who did the irrigation works, who made China suitable for agricultural development. The first king of China was portrayed. This is a rubbing from a stele of about 100 AD, 100 of the Common Era. It's the earliest portrait we have of Great Yu. Here he stands with a shovel in his hand. That's the first image of the king of China, a peasant, with a typical peasant hat you can still see today. Writing developed during the next dynasty, the Shang or Yin dynasty, from 1700 to 127. Here, the first forms of Chinese writing were used not to communicate between men, but to communicate between men and the ancestors, the gods. This was sacred writings in the hands of those scribes who knew the secrets, the secret language of the gods. In our Mediterranean cultures, it is the word that begins with everything. In China, it was the signal, the sign, the writing. It was writing who stands at the beginning of culture and also at the beginning of the revelation. These oracle bone inscriptions, discovered about 100 or some years ago, have now been deciphered and can be understood. And they are already essentially the same writing that China has today. If we talk about the unity of Chinese culture and the continuity of Chinese culture, that continuity is writing. And that is something we foreigners always have to bear in mind. If we teach Chinese, if we have Chinese classes, Chinese studies in our colleges and universities, writing is of paramount importance. Writing is always higher regarded than speech. Writing developed even more during the next Zhou dynasty, China really becomes its classical period, its classical era. Here we find not any longer just writings intended to communicate with supernatural beings, but to proclaim, to proclaim royal edicts that are then, thanks to the incredible craftsmanship of the ancient bronze artisans of China and their technology, that also brought the first metallurgic technology and, of course, the discovery of iron technology at a very, very early date, more than 1,500 years before Europe. We find melted into these bronze vessels the first long text like this one, which is in royal proclamation. And these same texts now are part of the earliest books in China, the great classics, of which I will say a few words more in a moment. When writing developed and knowledge developed, also philosophical speculation, thought about the world and the meaning of the world took hold. And from the very beginning in China there were two main ways of thought. The ways of Lao Tzu, who stressed nature in a philosophy we now call Taoism, and Confucius, whose teachings stressed culture and learning, and what we now call Confucianism. Of course, you know that Confucius never called himself Confucius because that's Latin. He was called Kongzi, and this was Latinized by the early Western missionaries who wanted to make him on par with our European classical philosophers. In the following period, writing developed even more. We can think that these philosophers talked, and their teachings were transmitted orally. But around the 5th century, before the Common Era, their words were put into writing on two kinds of support, on bamboo, slips, and on silk, both expensive and difficult ways of preserving writings, but the specimens you see have been unearthed recently in the recent, let's say, 50 years in China, and they have revolutionized our knowledge about ancient China and ancient culture. We are constantly changing our views too. Not only China is changing, but our understanding of Chinese culture and Chinese history is changing, thanks to these sensational archaeological finds. First of the oracle bone inscriptions, then the decipherment of the bronze inscriptions, and finally the great finds, hundreds of finds, archaeological finds, of texts found in tombs of the ancient philosophers and ancient histories. One very important date in human history is 221 before the Common Era, when China ended up by being united, not only militarily, but also ideologically, into one big state.